Thank you everybody for joining us today for today's webinar, which is on Windchill 11 Component and Supplier Management. I am going to be your presenter for the day. My name is Wade Morvek. I'm with Boundary Systems. I'll give you a little more information about myself in a second here. But first of all, just a quick look at the agenda. Just going to do a quick introduction to myself and to Boundary Systems. Then we'll go into an overview of component and supplier management. And specifically in Windchill, we're going to be talking about the parts link and supplier management, or SUMA modules, are sort of the main sort of Windchill modules that are used for managing components and sourcing and things like that. I'll do a live demonstration to actually show you what that looks like in the software, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A at the end. If you do have questions, everybody is muted currently, so if you have a question, you can use the raise hand icon over in the GoToWebinar panel, or you can type a question into the question box, and I will try to get to those as we go. Just a little bit about myself. Like I said, my name is Wade Morvek. I'm the Director of Global Services with Boundary Systems. I have 18 plus years of experience with PTC products, starting out with Creo, doing a lot of, or Pro Engineer at the time, doing a lot of training. And then for the last 10 years or so, really have been focused on the Windchill and PLM side of things, doing training, consulting, implementation, all of those types of things. Boundary Systems, we are a partner with PTC, so we support Creo, Windchill, starting to get more into the IoT side of things as well, with ThingWorx and PTC Navigate. And then we also are partners with several additional technology companies, such as Solid Thinking, e.t.c, and ZWCAD, that fill maybe some niche areas that PTC does not fill, in terms of lightweighting components, doing more advanced fluid dynamics or things like that. Our capabilities, again, we're focused on product lifecycle management or product development, so we can help you out with CAD design and consulting, CAD training, Windchill training, implementation services, as well as again, simulation. If you're looking for simulation solutions, if you're looking for help simulating specific components, all of those types of things. Here are some of our industry awards and accreditations at Boundary Systems. Like I said, here are some of our partners. Also, not on this slide, we also work with Minter Graphics. We support Flow EFD, computational fluid dynamics software. I think we've had some webinars on that recently, and possibly more coming up soon. And so, before we dive into component and supplier management, here's our contact information. If you do have additional questions following the webinar, feel free to reach out to me by email for technical questions, or if you have questions on pricing and packaging and things like that, you can email sales@boundarysys.com. There's also a link down at the bottom that shows sort of where you can go on PTC's website for additional information on Parts Link and SUMA. So when we're looking at component and supplier management, there are several challenges that we're trying to address. One of the biggest ones is just the proliferation of parts and materials and suppliers across product lines. It can be very easy if you don't have a system in place to help you out with managing components. If you need to use a bolt in an assembly, it can very easily become so difficult to find the existing bolt that people just create a new bolt in CAD. Okay, it's easy enough to go in and create this geometry. I'm just going to create it. I'm going to put it into the assembly, and so we can end up with a lot of different CAD models basically for the same bolt, which just makes it difficult to keep track of that, and then also introduces even bigger issues when we get to managing supply chain and sourcing those components, because we have a bunch of different internal part numbers for that same component. A lot of times there's no common part library between engineering and sourcing. Inconsistent identification of parts, so there's no consistent way to search for a specific naming convention or anything like that to locate that. Lack of visibility into supply chain. And again, it can be a time-consuming and manual process to gather that information. And so, again, we can end up recreating the same part over and over and over again, or if we have a choice between multiple similar parts to use in a certain situation, we don't have good visibility into non-design criteria such as cost or sourcing status or anything like that that's going to help us to select the optimum component to use in that situation. And this becomes a bigger and bigger issue as a larger quantity of components in most products are sourced. And so for the 2010 Ford Mustang, for example, 70% of the product was sourced. So managing those components and those suppliers is very critical to managing the overall project. The other thing to keep in mind is that the earlier that you can get access to this information and make the correct choice for which component to use in a certain situation, the better off you're going to be. So most of the cost of a product is locked in after the initial design stage, and so once you get past that point, trying to make changes, trying to choose which components to use and things like that, it becomes much more difficult. It really doesn't save you as much as if you can provide the designers access to all of that information very early in the process, give them the tools to select the optimum component, right from the very beginning. That's where you're going to get the biggest benefit in terms of cost savings and all of those things. So when we're looking at managing components and suppliers and selecting proper components, what are some of the requirements that we need to look at? The first is the ability to reuse existing parts. And so to do that, we need some way of classifying those parts in order to make it easy to search for and find those components. So if I know I need a specific type of bolt or socket head cap screw or capacitor in a certain situation, I need to be able to quickly go in, tell it what the key characteristics are that I'm looking for, and have our existing component library organized in a way where it says, okay, here are the components that are going to meet that criteria. Now the other option is, maybe based on my criteria, I may have multiple options that all satisfy my specific criteria. So now, how do I select which of those to use? Well, in order to select that correct component, it would be nice to have access to sourcing info and supplier info so that I can select based on that. So, okay, any of these 4 components shown in my search down at the bottom may satisfy my design criteria, but I can see that the sourcing status for 1 is preferred, for 2 it's a do not use, and for 1 I don't have any information. And so I can quickly say, okay, if any of these will work, let's go to the one that has a preferred sourcing status, because I know we have a preferred supplier for that, and we haven't been told not to use that particular component for any reason. So those are the things that Windchill is going to allow you to do with these modules that we're looking at today. The classification and searching criteria, that's the capability that's sort of contained within Windchill Parts Link, and then the identifying of approved manufacturer and approved vendor lists and sourcing statuses and all of those things, that's captured in the Windchill Supplier Management. And we'll take a look at both of those in the demonstration. And so again, a lot of different benefits to having sort of very good control over your component and supplier management. It can reduce the cost of goods sold, increase or speed up your time to market, improve quality. It can improve your engineering productivity if you're not recreating the same parts over and over again, and you're not spending a lot of time trying to search for the existing parts. it can really help you get more actual design work done and reduce late stage engineering changes because you have access to that information up front. A couple of things specific to how component and supplier management is handled within Windchill. One key concept is the idea of a sourcing context. And so this allows us to define different sourcing contexts that define the sourcing environment and common characteristics. And they can have different approved manufacturer and approved vendor lists based on that sourcing context. So if we're building a product in North America versus building the product in Asia, which suppliers are approved and which specific vendors are approved for a specific component may be different depending on where that actual manufacturing is taking place. And so we can use sourcing context to capture that and actually change through to see how does changing the sourcing context affect everything within the same product. And then also just the idea of the AMLABL, so approved manufacturer list or approved vendor list. And again, the difference there is the approved manufacturer list is basically a list of specific manufacturer parts, who are the different components or different companies that we can use to actually make that part, whereas the approved vendor list is, where can you buy the part. So you can have both of those. You can have approved manufacturer parts, as you see on the left, and then we can have potentially multiple different vendors that we can get some of those parts from, or you can have just vendor parts, as we've shown on the right. For example, if we're, it's not an off-the-shelf component, somebody we've designed something that we're going to have made, we can have just the approved vendor for those potentially. So you can use the manufacturer parts or the vendor parts or both, depending on your situation. So that's sort of what we're going to look at here today is, how can we use these tools in Windchill in order to classify our standard components and make it easier to find and select and use the correct component, and then also provide visibility into the actual sourcing information for those components. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and jump into Windchill. And so within Windchill, I am currently logged in as one of my classification administrators. So as the classification administrator, I have an additional tab in my Browse Navigator over here that allows me to manage my part classifications. And so, how you classify your components is totally configurable. For example, for electronic parts, I can go in and view different types of classification. So within electronic parts, I have capacitors. Within capacitors, I have fixed or adjustable. Within fixed, I have several different types of capacitors. And then, for example, if I go to film, now I can go in and define attributes on that specific capacitor, that specific type of capacitor. So I could go in as the administrator. I could edit this. I can add additional attributes to that. I can look through my reusable attributes here. And so, for example, I can add my film thickness, film material to that classification. So that's going to allow me to define default values. I can define constraints on that value. And so by defining that, when I create a new film type capacitor, I can enter values for all of those attributes. And then when I'm going back and I'm looking for a capacitor of that type, I'll be able to search and filter based on that attribute information. So, and again, I have a large hierarchy over here. I'm going to cancel that change, where I have mechanical components, I have electrical components, and within each of those, I have all of the different standard types of components. And at each of these levels, I can put attributes on there. So, again, within mechanical components, if I go to fasteners, I can search. Here's my fasteners. I have different top-level types of fasteners, and I can put, for example, on the screw type, I can put attributes at that level, or I can drill down, I can put attributes on the lower level components, depending on whether they're going to apply to just that specific classified type of object or to all of those. So that's, you sort of have to set up, how do we want to classify things? What are the criteria by which we need to select these different types of components? And we capture that as the attributes. From a user perspective, once I have that classification done and I have my attributes classified, now when I go to do a search, I can either do a standard search and search for that information, or I can use the Classification Explorer to sort of browse through all of those different classifications. So I can go in, for example, to mechanical parts here, and I can browse down through fasteners. You can see I also get my classification tree over on the left that I can browse through there, or I can use my little images over here on the right. So I'm going to look at bolts, or if I look at bolts, here are my different categories of bolts, or I can go back up a level. I can look at different categories of screws. And if I go to, for example, my shoulder screw, now at that level, it's going to bring up, I drilled all the way down, so here's a list of all of my shoulder screws. And then I also have my refine results option over on the right. So if I know I'm looking for a specific width across the flat between 1.3 and 1.5, I can drag the sliders or type in the values, and I can apply that to filter that list out based on that width across the flats. I can clear that if I want to and go back to the full list. I can also go in, if I do a search, I can do, and I can edit my search criteria here. So within my my advanced search, I can also choose a classification, basically a specific classification, in this case cap screws, to search for. And when I run that search, again, it's going to give me my results. So a couple different ways that I can search for the same classification information. I can go to the Classification Explorer and sort of browse to drill down, or I can use my advanced search, or even create saved searches to search for specific criteria and get to those parts that way as well. Again, in this case, I have a specific results view set up for the cap screws that shows the thread length and the length in here. And I also see my sourcing status. And so this is where the classification of this information and this classification search, that's using the Windchill Parts Link functionality for classification and reuse. But now we're also getting visibility into the supplier management functionality by seeing the sourcing status on here. So we have, again, approved manufacturer list or approved vendor lists for these components. So for our own internal part numbers, we have related manufacturer or vendor parts, and we can see what is the best status for any of these. So for example, this cap screw down at the bottom, we have a do not use status on. Some of these we have a preferred status. And so if I go in and I want to drill down even further and figure out, here's all of my cap screws, I want to select this based on the length. I know I need a length somewhere between 65 and 70. And when I do that, now we're down to, I've got, and my thread length for all of those is 1 centimeter. The length is all 65. So these all meet my criteria. Again, that gets back to, I've got 4 different selections. Which one do I pick? Because I have visibility into that sourcing info, now I can pick based on the sourcing status. So I can choose one of these 2 preferred cap screws and avoid anything that says do not use or doesn't have manufacturing information or anything like that. The other thing is, if you look at my search criteria here, right now, I'm looking at a sourcing context of North America. And so this, all of my sourcing status information here is based on the sourcing context of North America. If I'm actually going to manufacture this in Asia, I can edit my search criteria and I can change my sourcing context to one of the other contexts that's defined here. So I'm going to change that to Asia and rerun the same search. And again, adjust my length requirements. And so this turned up the same 4 part numbers that we were looking at before, except now I have a do not use status on a couple of those and a preferred on one. So now, if I'm sourcing this from Asia or for use in Asia, it's a lot quicker to make the decision. I have one preferred one. I'm just going to grab that one and go with it because that's essentially going to be the best one based on the information that I have here. If I go back to North America again, in this case, I have a couple of the cap screws that are preferred, and so I'm going to take a closer look at each of those. So I'm going to open each of these up in a new tab. So here's the first one. And if I look at the details for this particular part, you can see I have all of my classification attributes here. Full length, head diameter, head height, all of that information. I have some specific instant attributes that are defined on there. And then if I go to my AMLABL tab, this is accessing my supplier management functionality. And so I can see for this C23 screw, I have one manufacturer part associated to it, manufactured by Texas Instruments. Again, I can change my sourcing context right here on the details page if I want to see the information about that one in Asia. It's basically the same same manufacturer part defined, but my manufacturing sourcing status changed from preferred to do not use. So again, I can see I've got the same list available, but the status of them can change depending on my sourcing context. Let me go back and look at the other preferred screw here. And on this one, I can see, again, I can go to the details and view all my instance and classification information. And if I go to my approved manufacturer and approved vendor list, now I have a couple of manufacturer parts defined. And once again, if I switch from North America to Asia, in Asia, the actual manufacturer of one of these changed. So we've got a different part listed in Asia than we had in North America, but both of those are preferred in Asia, whereas in North America, the one is preferred and the other one is approved. So, we should have a preference of which one we would use in this case. So again, this is where all of my, for this specific part, any manufacturers or vendors that are available for that part will be listed here with their sourcing status. So we can go in and control, is that approved? Is it preferred? If we said we shouldn't use that particular manufacturer for this part, we can see all of that information. The other cool thing that you can see here is the list of AMLABL changes. So we can see what are all of the changes that have been made to the list of manufacturer and vendor parts for this particular OEM part number throughout this time. And so we can see when we had manufacturer parts added, we can see when we changed the sourcing status from preferred to do not use. We actually removed a manufacturer part. So once we said not to use it, we changed this from preferred to approved. We changed this from do not use to preferred. We removed that. We actually can maintain that entire history and see what has happened to this part over time. And what's nice about that is we're not making changes to the actual, our internal part number. Sometimes, people will try to manage some of the same sourcing information just with attributes directly on the WT part objects. We can go to our details page and see who is our manufacturer, who's our vendor, what is the status. But now if we need to make a change to that, we're going to get this from a new supplier now, we would have to check this part out, make a change to that value and check it back in, and we're trying to iterate it, and we shouldn't be able to do that with it released. By capturing this as information on separate part objects, we can go in and we can change all of that information, have it apply to this part without trying to go through and iterate and create new versions of this part. Now in this case, let's say we want to go in and we want to get some more information about one of the manufacturers. The manufacturers also are set up as Windchill objects. There's manufacturer information, there's vendor information in here. And so I can come in, take a look at Texas Instruments, and we're going to see general information, what's their address, what's the website, who's our primary contact, or do we have additional contacts there? We can have supplier documents here. So we've got a company profile, we got an organization chart, stored right there that we can get to from any of the manufacturer parts in Windchill. We can get right to the manufacturer information. We can view all of this additional information. The other thing that you'll be able to get from there, if I scroll up, is the state of this particular manufacturer. So we can actually use life cycle controls on the manufacturers within Windchill, where I can create a new manufacturer, I can enter all of the information, and then through standard Windchill workflows or promotion processes, we can have this go through an approval process. We can have somebody check to make sure we've added any documents that are required to be submitted before we can approve somebody as a manufacturer. We can capture and track all of that directly in Windchill, just like we do for the release of our individual components and CAD models and documents. We can provide or apply similar processes to approving manufacturers within here. The other tab that I have available here are my supplied parts. So within here, I can go in and see, here are all of the manufacturer parts associated with Texas Instruments. If I go to the information page on one of those, that was a bad selection. Too bad. But I will have a where used report here. Yep. Thought that was one. I'm not sure which of these has, so let me go back to my, look for this. If I find that, there we go. So if I go to one of those specific manufacturer parts, just like for a standard part in Windchill, I can go to my where used report and see what assemblies that's used in. Here I can go to my where used report and I can see the specific parts that are associated to this particular manufacturer part, and then for those OEM parts that are associated to this manufacturer part, I can see any locations where they are used. So if I'm thinking about changing the sourcing status on a component, or I'm thinking about getting rid of one, just like I can go in and see, okay, I was going to make a change to this component in Windchill. Before I do that, what assemblies are going to be impacted? And I can go to my where used and get that information. I can do the same thing here. So that's sort of looking at it from the component level. I'm trying to pick a particular cap screw. So I did the search. I filtered that down. Once I found the cap screws that sort of satisfied both my design requirements and my sourcing requirements, now I can drill down and see, what manufacturer part should we select? Are there any preferences within there? The other thing that I may want to look at is just from sort of a BOM level, what components are currently used within that bill of materials or within that full product. So I'm going to do a search for an assembly. And so here's my motherboard assembly, and I want to go in and view this information from that level. So I'm going to go to the information page. If I go to the details, I'll be able to see, again, my representation of this motherboard assembly. And now I'm going to go to the structure tab, and I'm going to view all of the information from sort of the product structure side of things. So let me go to my visualization tab here. And there we go. All right. So here's the motherboard product that we're currently looking at. And over here on the left, you can see we've in the structure view, we have shown some additional information. So if I go to views, you can see that I have a sourcing status view. I also have some WPA views. And so in this case, the risk of conflict, this is some information out of the Windchill product analytics, for sort of environmental compliance that we're showing here. That's a separate module. But the main thing we're interested in this case is this sourcing status column. So again, I'm able to go in and see, okay, what's this one do not use component? I can select that. I can see, okay, that's, I can, of course, zoom on that selected component. I can see, okay, these components are highlighted. They have a do not use status within the current sourcing context. Again, if I want to check to see what sourcing context I'm viewing this from in my views, I have a sourcing context option. So this is looking at it from a North American perspective. If I switch to Asia, it's going to update all of my my sourcing information. And so now if I go in and I select that same component that we were looking at before, I can see there's actually an approved sourcing status for that within Asia. And so, I can set this based on my context or my sourcing context and get the information that is relevant to me. So let's switch back to North America here. And we're going to look at a couple of these components in a little more detail. So these top two that do have a preferred sourcing status, if I select one of those, I can go in and view additional information about that. So I may want to show related documents, which apparently it does not have any related documents, and also the AMLABL list. And so that's going to expand out and show we actually have two manufacturing parts associated with that. One of those does have a status of do not use. The other one has a status of preferred. And so you can see the fact that it does have some manufacturing part that is preferred, that's what rolled up to the top. And, the fact that I can't use this one doesn't matter because this other one is preferred anyhow. If this one was do not use also, then we get the do not use status. And in this case, we have the two manufacturing parts. We also have two vendor parts associated with the one manufacturing part. So I can actually go to a specific vendor now. I could view information on there, get all the information about what vendor is that and any of the other information that we're tracking there. I'm going to select this next component down. I'm also going to show the AMLABL list for that one. And again, you can see in this case, I have a whole list of manufacturing parts available for this particular processor component, and again, the status of many of those is approved. One is preferred. So this would be where we would ideally source that component from. If we can't get it for some reason from there, we also have other approved manufacturers that we could go to. So that's where, again, I can view that information right here from my structure page. I can get access to that very quickly. If I have permissions if I'm sort of a supplier administrator, I can even go in right from this view and say, okay, we actually just got an update on this. This is not do not use anymore. This is actually approved now. I can change that right there in my structure view. And again, that's going to update wherever else that component may be referenced. What if I want to export the BOM to actually view elsewhere? If I go generate my BOM report, so I'm going to grab my full motherboard assembly again, and I'm going to generate a multi-level BOM, and I have the option of multi-level BOM with AMLABL or with just AML. So I'm going to do AML. So that gives me my bill of materials report with the manufacturer parts for each component listed there, along with their sourcing status, and I'm going to have the ability to export that list to Excel or CSV to use that elsewhere as well if I want to. I can also go back and do comparisons. So I can generate that BOM report. If I want to go in and see how has some of this the supplier information changed over the history of this product, I can select my top level item again and do a BOM compare. And so for my comparison, on the right side, I'm going to have the current version of this structure defined. And on the left, I'm going to compare this to a baseline. So this is going to apply a baseline from when this structure was initially defined. Okay. And in my preferences, I have the option of whether I want to include the AML/AVL information within the structure comparison or not. If I do have that turned on, it lets me know that I can choose my sourcing context back on the parts page as long as this is turned on. So if I go back to parts, I can see I am comparing the North American sourcing context to North American, just the current version versus the baseline. When I do this comparison, now it pulls this up, and I can see, like, for this component, the icons in the middle here, right here, are showing me where I have differences between them. And actually, anything that's highlighted in blue, there is a difference on, so I can see I have differences almost everywhere here. In this case, if I expand this one over here, the different differences, it tells me there's child differences, attribute differences on both sides. And so in this case, I actually did not have any of my sourcing information defined when this bill of material was originally created. So all of the sourcing information is new over here on the right, and I can see how that has been added as I expand out through the tree. Of course, I can step through the next difference. So in this case, I can just see, okay, I added all of my manufacturer parts to the to my internal part numbers since we created that baseline. But another way I could do a comparison that may be more illuminating right here, if I go back and start with the same compare tool, but this time, instead of going back and comparing versus an earlier version of this assembly that I have a baseline of, I'm going to look at the difference between the Asia sourcing context and North America. So I'm looking at the same version of the assembly, and so when I do that, now when I step through the differences, my two actual parts are the same, but the sourcing, the manufacturer parts are going to be different. So both of these are the same, both of these are the same, but in Asia, I have one additional approved manufacturer for that particular part. if I look at the next component, the processor, again, we've got two components that are the same, and then I have a whole list of additional manufacturing components that are approved in the North American context, but not in the Asia context. I could have I do have the option to show only the differences. That's going to sort of collapse it down and allow me to really focus on where do I have differences between the components in those structures a lot more quickly than trying to just hit next and skip through that entire structure. So I have two different ways I can view that. And then if I go back to, again, one of these specific components, you can drill down and select that, view the information on there. Again, I can have documents associated to that. I can have all my, this is sort of basically a part object within Windchill that is going to have life cycle controls, change management, all of those things that can be applied to it. And again, when I look for the where used report, like I showed you before, instead of just showing me here are all of the assemblies where this part is used, it's going to show me, here's any parts where this is associated as part of the AMLABL to that part. And once I go view that, now I'm going to be able to go to the AMLABL tab and view, what else is included in there. In addition to this one, are there other options in the same place? So if I know, hey, somebody's discontinuing a specific vendor part, and I need to figure out, okay, do we have any replacement options already, or do we need to go find a brand new vendor for that? I can start at that vendor part number and work backwards and find, okay, here's where this is used. Here are our other options that are already available in each of our different sourcing contexts, or yeah, there is no other option. We need to go out. We need to find a new supplier for that particular component before we get too far down the road and realize this one thing is going to hold us up on the entire project. So again, that's a quick overview, but those are the types of things that you can do with Windchill Parts Link and Windchill Supplier Management. Again, the key concepts there are trying to make it easier for the designers and the engineers to find existing components that they need to use in their current products by classifying them. So okay, I need a particular caster to put on some assembly that we're building. I can go into my mechanical components, I can drill down, I can choose specific requirements from those classification attributes, and I can select that particular component rather than saying, I don't know where somebody has saved this. I don't know where this has been used before, so I'm just going to go in and create a new component that's going to satisfy my requirements. And then once we get to that, also capturing all of that supplier information so that we can go in and see, hey, I may have several options. Which of these do we know we have good sources for to go out and get these parts from? And I don't just go in and say, okay, this one's going to satisfy my design requirements. I'm going to use that one. I put it in the assembly. We base all of our decisions from that point forward on using that particular component. And then when we get to the end of the process, we realize, oh, that one was a bad choice because we don't have any approved manufacturers for that. Whereas if we chose this other one, we do. And now we have to go through a bunch of much more complicated changes to either find an approved manufacturer for the one that we selected, or go actually make some design changes in order to use the other one that already comes from an approved manufacturer. So again, that's the idea, trying to give better visualization or better access to all of that necessary information early in the process, so that you can make informed design decisions. And the one other thing, I don't have it shown here, what we're looking at in terms of our sourcing status here. If I go in and I edit edit the sourcing status, have access to that in this particular case under this user. But I can edit the sourcing status. That's going to allow me to change, approved or preferred or do not use. I can update the sourcing status. Those are sort of configurable. That's the out-of-the-box option. But if you have other sourcing statuses that you use internally, or you want to have more granular breakdown of that, those things can be sort of customized, just like your life cycle states and things can be. Typically, out of the box works pretty well, but you do have some control over that. All right, so that's again, that's pretty much what we wanted to show you today regarding component and supplier management in Windchill 11. Before we wrap up, I will open it up for questions. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to type them into the questions box, or you can raise your hand and I can temporarily unmute you. I also have put up the contact information again. Contact information, if you do think of a question after we end the webinar, feel free to email myself or to email sales@boundarysys.com with those questions. And I will just wait and see if anybody has any. All right, no questions so far. Thanks to everybody for joining. Hopefully you found it informative. Like I said, if you do have questions that you think of after you hang up, feel free to reach out to us and we'd be happy to answer those. But otherwise, thanks for joining. I'll hang out on the line just for a few more minutes if somebody does come up with questions. But otherwise, have a great rest of your day.